Welcome to our monthly consciousness book raising club. Tonight we are talking about we need a Department of Peace, everybody's business, nobody's job. And our mission at the Peace Alliance is to empower civic action toward a culture of peace. We are guided by the 5 cornerstones of peace: community peace building, humanizing justice systems, fostering international peace, personal peace, and practicing peace in schools. And the 5 cornerstones are endorsed in the Blueprint for Peace. And when you go to the Blueprint for Peace, you can click on that and sign it, and it goes to all of your elected officials and lets them know that you want them to vote and bring bills that are dedicated to peace building. That is on our website, peacealliance.org. On the very top, you can see all of the different links for the 5 cornerstones of peace, the calendar, the donation hyperlink. And tonight, and of course, we have the Department of Peace Building, which are cornerstones, and the Blueprint for Peace all feed into the Department of Peace Building. And what we're talking about tonight is the history of the Department of Peace Building, which has been with us since the founding of this country. So I want to start with a quote. Well, first of all, let me ask, who liked the book? Yeah, me too. Molly, were you able to read it yet?
No, I really appreciate you bringing it to the table. I don't have one, and I would be interested in reading it, but I have some questions on the concept of a Department of Peace.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, I'm glad you're here. Actually, Karen Johnson, who is on the call with us tonight, brought this to my attention and recommended it for our reading, and I really loved the book also. So I want to open with a quote. This is on page 46 if you want to read along. Planning for war has been a major preoccupation of all national governments for many centuries. No useful purpose is served by pretending that planning for war fosters peace. The contrary is the case. You get what you plan for. Many of us are bewildered by the ancient Roman adage, if you wish peace, prepare for war. So, anybody want to say anything about that?
True.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So aptly put, isn't it? Very succinct, and it says so much. I really loved this book. He did that a lot. Okay, anybody want to share anything before I share another quote? Anybody bring anything they want to share from the book?
I just wanted to ask, how do you envision it would be a department? It would be a Department of Peace in the cabinet.
Nancy or Karen or Kendra, y'all want to answer that?
Yes, a cabinet level department with a Secretary of Peace Building, and then it would have some sub offices within that department.
Mm-hmm. How would it work with the military?
I mean, I think we'd like to think we would cooperate with them in preventing violence, and also in the roles they have in patching up countries after violence has already happened. So.
The book actually addresses that really well, and we'll get into that a little bit more, but go ahead, Nancy. I don't want to interrupt you.
I was just going to say, if anybody wants to add anything to that.
Yeah.
Oh, some of the military people that we have met and talked with about this, they have said that they could really use peace builders. And I think to prevent wars and to while they're conducting wars, actually, because they don't have the training in peace building, and they go into a culture that they're not familiar with and a language that they don't speak, and they need help.
Mhm. I think that's good. That's interesting.
Yeah.
I wanted to start with the title of the book.
Yeah,
We
Go
need
for
a
it.
Department of Peace, everybody's business, nobody's job.
Mhm.
And I just think that's very eloquent in itself. We don't, I think that we think as a nation that that the government is what has to promote peace between nations. But we have to start at the bottom. All of us have to start at the bottom, being peaceful people. And we certainly know in our current culture that we've got so many divisions and so many harms that are not being addressed.
There's something on the bottom of page 36 that talks about why this should not be part of the State Department. It says the considerations to be adduced in support of this view, the view that the Department of Peace could be in the State Department, have nothing to do with longstanding and ever-mounting criticisms of the State Department. So it's not that the State Department doesn't function well, as some people criticize it for. There's a different reason for not having it there. Let's see, did I have the right? Oh, yeah. So the contention is plausible on the premise that problems of power in world politics can be resolved only by war or by diplomacy. Since the Department of State and the Foreign Service are charged with the conduct of diplomacy, their purpose might seem to some to be the promotion of peace. This is not the case, has never been the case, and cannot ever be the case, because diplomacy is potential war. After all the talks are done, the only thing left is war. What do y'all think about that? I thought that was pretty profound.
Yeah, that page caught my attention too. And yeah, the other thing I think that a point that I've raised over the years, that diplomacy is not peace building. And I think in the book there, they also mentioned that diplomacy is looking out for the best interests of our country, that each country is doing that, which
Right.
is different than trying to find common ground or ways through conflicts. So yeah, just like we've said all through this campaign, which is past this book, but it's also very related and very similar to what they're laying out here. That we're not talking about replacing the Department of Defense. We're talking about working with them and adding soft power to the toolbox available to our country, both as conflicts arise and trying to settle things before it goes to war, and then if it does have to go to war for some reason, then having a better cleanup afterwards that perhaps would not have the hostilities that are inevitable after a war situation, maybe last as long or hurt as deeply and so forth. So yeah, I think that was a good point. I mean, I imagine other people might articulate that a little bit differently, but I don't know that many people would really disagree with the idea that we need a State Department and a Department of Defense and a Department of Peace.
Right.
It's not just one of them. We need all three. Yeah.
Right. And he also made the point that the Secretary of the Department of Peace should be should not be appointed by the State Department and should not answer to the State Department. And they should be the person that is our delegate to the UN, not somebody from the State Department.
Hmm.
I thought that was a really good point too.
Yeah, what comes up for me listening to y'all talk about these different, that I'm going to ponder on that for a while. The idea that diplomacy is, I think, in pictures. And so based on what you read, Kathy, I'm seeing diplomacy as being on the same road to war. You know, it's not, I don't know that I've ever really thought specifically about that before. So I'm going to spend some time on that. But the, Molly, one of the things that when someone asked me about the question that you brought up, which is how would this relate to, you know, the Department of Defense or the military, my first answer is that it's both and, not either or.
Mhm.
And I know that can sound maybe a little too simplistic, but I think it speaks on a broad scale. It speaks to the simplicity of what we're asking, that sometimes the counter arguments can get all in the weeds about, well, what about this and what about that, and this is going to replace that, and you want to take this from that and do this, and that just serves to dilute and make it really challenging to wade through the conversation. So for me, it's just as simple as it's both and, not either or. You know, nobody is saying that we don't necessarily need. I would love to live in a world that nobody needs a military. I'm down for that, but this doesn't have to be. We don't have to wait for that inevitability to talk about how to actively build peace.
Mhm.
I just wanted to add that.
Yeah.
One of the things that I always think about when we talk about the Secretary of State is that the State Department actually has in its toolbox weapons of war. I mean, they trade as diplomacy. They trade weapons of war, and that bothers me a lot.
Yeah. Yeah, their diplomacy is providing weapons. Is
I
that
thought there was,
I
I
got
thought
it.
there was one interesting passage, sort of contrasting why we need an actual department or actual energy and people devoted to peace building, contrasted with the huge mechanism we have for war. And they were writing, somebody wrote, we are trying to halt a juggernaut in our spare time with marginal energy and with our own money between sales meetings, trips to the orthodontist, weddings, funerals, lectures, little league, sitting on boards, et cetera, et cetera. Quite a job for even the most dedicated volunteer brigade. It's discouraging to remember that on Monday morning, after our March dispenses, thousands of employees will show up in the Pentagon, ready to put in another productive week in the service of the juggernaut, paid for by us.
I have to go. I really appreciate you ladies answering my question. I really appreciate it. Have a wonderful evening. Thanks for Zooming. Take care.
Thank you.
Okay.
Bye.
Thank you for coming, Molly.
You know, the other thing I like about the history of the bill, it was there's some controversy about who it was written by, whether it was written only by Benjamin Rush or by Benjamin Rush and Benjamin Banneker. Benjamin Banneker published it. He was an African-American man, mathematician, astronomer, and he had a farm. He was born free. His parents were enslaved. And the other person that was part of this was somebody who signed the Declaration of Independence. He was a physician, politician, social reformer, humanitarian, educator, and the founder of Dickinson College. So I think that the birthing of this has some meaning as far as building peace, because we've been trying to bring that reconciliation together since the founding of our country. Right?
Yeah.
So I really love that about it.
Yeah, definitely brings a different twist when you think about how difficult those conversations maybe were, and getting together and writing what needed to be written at a time where a Black person and a white person working together on anything was not well received.
Right. And he actually had wrote to Thomas Jefferson, and they had a correspondence going all the time. And he was trying to understand how Thomas Jefferson could say all men were created equal, but had slaves.
Yeah.
But Thomas Jefferson never really answered the question. And so there's some archives from their correspondences. Apparently there was a fire in his house after he died. So a lot of his stuff, Benjamin Banneker's stuff, was lost. But there is some stuff still saved, which I think would be fascinating to find that and see, find out more. So anybody else want to say anything about that original bill and those two men getting together?
I just wanted to say that it was religiously oriented, but they also talked about the Secretary of Peace would establish and maintain free schools in the US. So that is so back far in our history that we didn't have a school system. And I just think that's great that they saw originally that the importance of education and cultivating peace.
Yeah.
I just thought that was pretty interesting.
Right. And somewhere in there, it said that the purpose of that first bill was to educate people about the importance of building peace. So because one of them was an educator, maybe they came from that point of view.
That is also interesting. They talked about inspiring veneration of human life and reform of the penal code, and some things like that I don't usually think of that would be talked about way back then.
I agree.
Isn't that all on the forefront now, though? I mean,
Yeah.
Well, it's interesting that we're still
Everything
dealing
all
with
this
all
new-
the same things, we're still.
Exactly.
well, somebody very famous for their sayings said at one time that lessons will present themselves over and over and over again until we learn them.
Yeah.
So clearly we're taking very wee baby steps to learn these lessons.
Yeah,
Right.
for sure. And then they talk about military titles should be set aside and all kinds of stuff like that. And it's like, yeah, that's pretty interesting. So
Yeah, those two struck me too, with how just imagining how those thoughts would have been received back then, because it was, like doing away with the courts too. And probably not a lot of people were familiar with native cultures that had restorative type practices. And maybe they were, and they weren't saying that specifically, or maybe not, but they just saw, without using the word punitive, they're basically saying, let's stop punitive justice. And yeah, so that's the field now, and it's going back to Aboriginal and Native cultures on how they maintained peace in the world. So in so many ways, that original plan for peace had all the elements needed for peace. The education got a little sidetracked. So instead of educating people on peace,
You're upset about that.
Yeah. They could use a little peace school themselves. But then the school system ended up being primarily to educate people how to to work in factories and
Right.
do things for work. It became actually educating the workforce. Just
Uh,
That was strange, a
Capitalism
little
continued.
strange how strange to us today, I guess, but maybe not then. Where he's talking about sort of the outer trappings of what an office of peace would look like, and having what does he say? A group of young ladies clad in white robes singing this song, and having this painting that represents military interests with human skulls, broken bones, unburied and putrefied dead bodies, houses, et cetera, et cetera. I'm like, wow, we didn't write that into our bill.
Yeah.
How graphic.
It's like really very graphic, and obviously the omission of women in there. So, and the emphasis on Christianity. So definitely those times, different times.
Yeah. Yeah. It was interesting to see all the Christian themes running through there, right?
Mhm.
Yeah, the history around that.
yeah, and I mean it, and when you look back on the times, like one of the chapters does, going back on some of the the paintings that he suggested being in the apartment for the Department of Peace building. I when I read this years ago, this stuff didn't stick with me, but now it does. Hey Chase, sorry about this. Yeah, it does have the elements, like back then there were the conflicts that were alive in the world, and he was looking at visioning and having paintings that show kind of represent or are metaphors for these conflicts have being resolved and people being in peace, or at least coming to the table and being in communication with each other. And so many of these things. So Christianity was the thing of the day. I think if they were writing this now, it wouldn't necessarily be about Christianity. It might be, but it might just be more about honoring religions or beliefs and the sanctity of life and the reverence for life, because we do hear that a lot in the last couple of decades with all the increased shootings. It's that some groups of society have lost a reverence for life. So that's a really key thing.
There is a little footnote that this certainly sounds like a call to the Buddhists to do no harm and the vegetarian lifestyle. Oh, okay.
Yeah. I thought it was also interesting, the 91st Congress in 1970. They had all the co-sponsors listed on page 49 and 50. And John Conyers was on there. Remember John Conyers?
Yes.
He was signed onto the bill every time we brought it forward.
Right.
Okay, so who wants to bring something else up before I move to the next thing?
Well, I just wanted to chime in on the building, because I never have really thought about what the building would be like for the Department of Peace building. And we have some very imaginative buildings in DC. So how would that be? I remember that at the Native American Museum, Nancy, they had the circle.
Mm-hmm.
They had a circular room and a circle around the fireplace. And I'm just imagining what we could do today to create an atmosphere of peace and reconciliation in the department.
We could combine the Native American Museum and USIP that has the dove on top and all that.
Somebody's joined. Oh, it looks like they're still connecting to audio.
Warrior Kings.
I know. I actually think this is my partner. I
Is
think
he a
that's
warrior king?
that's what he calls himself. It is.
Uh-oh.
That is Hugh McCall. So it's funny that he's trying to connect.
Yeah, on
Very
page 25, he talks about World War III, if we permit it to come, will not produce something similar to a Pax Romana. It'll produce 2 or more Carthages, destruction.
Mhm.
And he proposes peace would come if we could establish some semblance of a world government, but fears that countries don't want this, and this is accurate. We hear this today because they'll lose their sovereignty. But I saw this movie Arrival. Aliens landed here. Did anybody see that?
That is one of my all-time favorite movies.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah. And so,
absolutely.
yeah, so they came here to teach us, they said, because they were going to need us in 3,000 years. And what they taught us was for all the spaceships were in 12 different locations around the world. And some of the countries were ready to go to war with the spaceships, right? Typical human response. You're not our typical response, but typical, the way to solve it is war response. Well, the linguist that was talking to the aliens had some kind of, can you speak to what she had? Was it like she was seeing the future and the past? Also, time was like not separate for her because of the gift they gave her?
Yeah, I don't want to give too much away. If you all haven't seen the movie, I highly recommend it.
Yeah.
Amy Adams is the main character or actress that plays the main character. And yeah, she's having flashes. And when you're watching it as an observer, you don't know if what she's watching or what she's seeing is the future or the past. And yeah, they show up in 12 different places around the world, and the humans start by talking to each other, but then that quickly devolves into, we're not going to talk to each other because we have to, everybody went to their silos. And it's really fascinating because what they do, she is a linguist. And so the military brings her in to try to learn how to talk to these beings. So she's trying to approach them from a linguistic standpoint and trying to figure out what their language is. And yes, they do give her a gift, and it is the gift of sight, so that she can see the future and know that. And they do eventually say, we're going to need you in 3,000 years, so we need you to survive right now. We're going to give you this gift of the future so that you can survive, so that when we need you, you'll be around.
Right.
But it's just the concept of this, to talk about taking a 100,000 foot view of how to help each other intergalactically. It's a beautiful movie.
Right. And but the point that I got out of it was that everybody on Earth had to cooperate. Everybody.
Mhm.
China was involved, Russia was involved, India was involved, the US was involved. And to get through this crisis, we all had to cooperate, right?
Mhm.
And so that was beautiful. And wasn't exactly a world government, right? But it was, in the sense that the United States is made up of a bunch of states, right? So what if the world was made up of a bunch of countries, and they have to get along just like the United States gets along, right? We don't go to war with each other. We don't want to go to war with each other. Most of us don't want to. So that was the concept. And that's what I see him talking about here. It's like, if we could do that in our world, that would help us. But too many people are afraid of this one world government. There's a lot of stuff floating around about that. I'm sure it's, intentional. People that don't want that plant that stuff, those ideas, but.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's macro view versus micro view. I mean, we've talked a little bit about what if we could find a local or state level, what if we could find a group of folks at a local or state level that would be willing to start a whatever level Department of Peace at the state or local level, and see how it would work at the micro level, so that then we could expand it to the macro, and if anyone's listening to this podcast afterwards and has an idea about a state or a local government that would be willing to do that, please contact Peace Alliance. Because that's how we learn, right? Is by seeing it in a small version, so that then we can imagine what the bigger would be like.
Mm. Yeah.
In a way, that's what the European Alliance is like.
Yeah. European,
Mm-hmm.
definitely.
And people are struggling. They're totally struggling. And
You mean because of Brexit?
Well, no, that's one solution, was they broke apart. But right now, with the economies in all of the different countries, they're trying to deal with climate change and the economy, but everyone's economy is different.
Mm-hmm.
Every nation's economy is different. And so they're really struggling to how do they meet the needs of all these different countries. But that's kind of like what we aspire to, right?
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. I'm not sure I understand.
Well, all of the nations in Europe are governed as one, but they all are like states in our United States.
Right.
And yet they're trying to make decisions for the common government is trying to make decisions for all of the states that meet the needs of all of the states. And that's very difficult.
True. Yeah. Yeah, I guess if peace were easy, we wouldn't be still talking almost 400 years later about a Department of Peace.
Yeah. And the United Nations, I think, was formed to attempt to be that. And there's all kinds of things written in the charter about sovereignty of the nations.
Mm-hmm.
And so that really was the intention, but then even that people have concerns or so forth. So, but we still have a lot of looking out for own interests rather than shared interests. So I think we're at a place on the planet right now where our survival is hinging on us really coming together around our shared interests with the planet. So yeah, but it's neat to see that even without as strong of a global perspective back there, it's all the same thing because it's human nature. We're creating all of this, and they were laying a blueprint for how do we create peace instead of war over and over again. And it was interesting, their definition of war was 3,000 or more people dying because of something. So it wasn't necessarily a declaration of war, just like I think that was kind of comes into play with when they're talking about diplomacy, that it might not look like a war the way we think of it, but if people are using different diplomatic means, that there could be ongoing death in a region while they're trying to come up with a diplomatic solution rather than a peace building solution. So
Yeah.
I was very heartened by this, that in a way, we still have to have people be interested in the essence of it, but that it kind of just reinforced that we have the basics of it in the current bill, that this is all about human nature. The elements may change over time, but it's the same dynamic. We're dealing with, what we tend to do and how can we change that tendency? How do we see that it's in our best interest to change certain tendencies?
Right.
That one statement right at the very beginning of the book
Mhm.
was interesting. He really distilled it down to, he says the central argument is simply that peace is not only morally right, but it is a practical necessity.
Yeah,
And you can think of that on so many levels, why it's a practical necessity.
right, yeah. And he also mentioned that the reason we don't have it is because war is so profitable. But then in the end of the book, he says at the beginning, in the end of the book, he talks about how costly violence and war is, right?
Mhm.
Like reversing global warming. If we had done that many, many years ago, we wouldn't be where we are now.
We were talking about local departments of peace, and one of them I know about, I don't want to say which one, is experiencing just all the problems of human nature, which is like each nonprofit is sort of its own little fiefdom, and trying to figure out how we come together as one without feeling threatened, like by the whole idea of states being dissolved or whatever. So yeah, I mean, it is all tied in with the personal peace level too. Personal, community, state,
Right.
international, all of that, of course, they're all tied
Right.
in together.
Absolutely.
Well, and not to bring in another, evil ism, but capitalism, I don't know. I mean, I've heard a few folks tonight mention human nature, and I'm not sure it is human nature. I think it's something we're taught, and I feel like capitalism has a lot to do with that, because it is so exclusionary. It's all about, it's a zero-sum game. It's all about what I have is directly connected to what you don't have. And
Yes.
and so, I don't know if it's human nature. I'd like to think it's not. I'd like to think it's learned behavior from generations and generations and generations of doing it the same way over and over. And I've been thinking a lot. I've been binge watching Star Trek Discovery.
Mhm.
And I was never an original Trekkie. I didn't get into the original series, but Next Generation was my jam. And I, the lessons, Gene Roddenberry was so far ahead of his time, and the lessons
Definitely.
of how, and I'm watching Discovery and I'm thinking, these are galaxies that are learning how to work together, but they have similar challenges with worlds coming together, immensely diverse cultures and rituals and customs and belief systems, and yet they all know that they have to work together for their greater good of the galaxy. And again, another macro level, but I think we always have and there's a lot of them in there that aren't human, so maybe it's not human nature. I don't know what it is.
Yeah.
We're
Well,
talking
and it
about the
depends on
Federation here.
I know.
what you're saying is human nature. Like, I don't think war is human nature, but there are, one of the things that he points out that sometimes leads to violence is jealousies. So we certainly have the span of human emotions, but it's what we do with those emotions. Like, I always think of the book The Pedagogy of the Oppressed. And that really changed my perspective, that it is within human nature, if a group has been oppressed, as they're rising up and liberating themselves, they will have a tendency or a desire to want to oppress either the group that oppressed them or another group that might be more easily for them to oppress. And we can see this throughout history. So the author of that book was working in South America, in trying to, liberate and empower a group of people out of oppression. And so education around that, at the time, you can keep people. And I think it's when I read different stories about Martin Luther King, he operated in that way. When people would, like, example, a story about some people not being a big fan of Bobby Kennedy and him saying, well, we're not going to leave this room until everybody finds something good to say about the man, because they wanted him to be speaking for them more than he was. So it's, there are some things in human nature that we can educate ourselves about and understand our tendencies, just like the phrase hurt people. If you know that somebody has hurt you and your tendency might be to hurt back, you can stop and look at that and heal and not hurt back. So I don't think violence is inevitable like a lot of people think, but there are some things that we can be proactive about rather than knee jerk around, and that are part of human nature to some extent.
I have one more topic I'm going to introduce, and then we'll close the call. This is on page 49, and this is the crux of where we are at this time. Given the long record of the past, it must by now be clear that a Department of Peace will come into being only if an overwhelming majority of American citizens of all parties, all creeds, all classes, all races, and all sections make abundantly clear to their elective spokesmen in Washington that they are resolved that this new departure should be undertaken. Without such a public demand, nothing can be accomplished. And I would beg to differ with that. Everybody in this, the majority of people in this country want gun reform, want a lot of things, and we can't get it because of gerrymandering, dark money in politics. The landscape has changed so much. So the question is, how do we become effective at this point with politics as they are today? How do we use our time wisely? How do we get creative? How do we not do the same things over again that aren't working? Which we're all, kind of looking at that in our organization anyway, right? So that's the point I'm at right now. Is elected officials aren't listening to us. Of the 435 districts, or 36, I forget, only 40 are competitive. The rest are very sure bets that the candidate that the district has been gerrymandered to favor is going to win that election. So those representatives don't care what I have to say. Their election is locked in. So that's the $20 million question for me. How are we going to be effective at this time in politics?
I think that ties in with the fact that I think it's so interesting that not all that long ago, a lot of the bills, incarnations of the bills, were bipartisan. And there's no way today, right now, we're there.
I know.
And that's sad. It's really sad.
Yeah. In fact, in the book, he talks about in the 60s, there was nobody in Congress that opposed the bill. They weren't all on it, but they weren't criticizing it.
Mhm.
So yeah, things have definitely changed.
I think that's why I'm thinking a lot and talking a lot about empowering the electorate, and I know that there are pitfalls to that, as you just articulated, Kathy, that we have gerrymandered districts and we have things of that nature. But I wonder if the gerrymandered districts are only fully gerrymandered. I wonder if absolutely everyone in that district actually showed up to vote. Everybody that was of voting age and had and got themselves registered to vote and actually showed up to vote, whether or not that district could flip different than what the gerrymandering set it up to be. And I don't know the answer to that. Maybe the districts are so heavily gerrymandered because our electorate feels disempowered and disenfranchised to be able to show up. So that's why I'm thinking a lot about the one caveat, or the one bulk of movable body that we haven't seemed to really fully engage yet at the level to which it could be engaged is the electorate. You know, if everybody did that was of voting age and could vote without any other, you know, laws or whatever that stop them from voting, were able to come and cast a vote, what, you know, how could that change? Could we affect the change that we want? Could we get the people in office that will actually listen to us and turn the tides back to a movable, functioning government as we, you know, knew it to be at one time?
Right. Right. Yeah.
I
So we
think
have
there
about 5
was a
minutes.
massive effort in the last election. There was a massive effort.
And we had the highest turnout that we've had in 100 years.
Yeah. And
It works.
It does work. It does work. You know, and somebody said, I think it was Bishop Barber with the Poor People's Campaign said to me one time, and it's never left me. He said, and he may not have been the first person that said this, but I heard it from him. He said, they wouldn't be trying to stop you from voting so much if your vote didn't matter.
Exactly.
And I had never thought about it that way before. I had one of those light bulb moments. You know, if it wasn't important, they wouldn't be working so hard to stop it from happening.
Exactly.
I mean, I don't
All
think
right,
it's-
I'm gonna close the call. I'm gonna read a quote, and then I'd like each of you to spend a minute saying whatever you'd like to say to feel complete. This is on page 42. Man's method of dealing with difficulty in the past has always been to tell everyone else how they should behave. We've all been doing that for centuries. It should be clear by now that this no longer does any good. Everybody has by now been told by everybody else how they should behave. Therefore, everybody knows how everybody else thinks he should behave. The criticism is not effective. It never has been, and it is never going to be. There is only one telling that is effective, our telling ourselves how to behave.
Amen.
We hope you enjoyed this discussion. To find out about all of our programs, go to our calendar, www.peacealliance.org. Look at the top right-hand corner, you will see the calendar link to click on. We send one email a week on Mondays to let you know the upcoming events for that week. If you love and benefit from our programs we offer, consider donating. We are a small nonprofit and appreciate donations of any size. In particular, we appreciate monthly donors so that we can continue to support these kinds of programs with sustainable income. We currently have a goal of raising $20,000 and enrolling 22 monthly donors. You can go to peacealliance.org, and in the top right-hand corner, you will see the donate button. If you miss any of our calls, you can listen to them on our Peace On podcast. See the link on the homepage to get to our Peace On podcast. And you can share this with Facebook and other friends that you have. You can like us on Facebook if you haven't already. And just search for the Peace Alliance on Facebook. So thank you for joining us. We hope that it inspires you to engage in dialogue in your larger community. Peace On is brought to you by the Peace Alliance, found at peacealliance.org.